Good afternoon, everyone. This is a replacement talk. The Monsanto talk was canceled. This is Unmasking You with Jabra and our snake.
Excellent. All right, so either way. Testing. So thank you everybody for coming. And yeah, so we're here to talk about privacy. This talk is all about privacy, looking at a lot of different issues, releasing some various types of demos, code, really a lot of cool stuff. So again, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy it.
So I'm RSnake. I run a small consultancy firm called Sec Theory. I also run Hackers and Slackers. If you want to know more about me, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. I'm not going to pimp myself here, but.
So I'm Josh Abraham, also known as Jabra. I'm a security researcher at Rapid7. I do a lot of pen testing, web application assessments, security testing. I also work on a lot of different open source projects like the Backtrack Live CD and a few other projects. I also run a blog at exploit.org, so feel free to send me an email.
So why does this whole privacy thing matter? Why are we even talking about it? It just sort of seems like kind of a boring topic in certain circumstances. But I think it's actually a really interesting topic if you start thinking about how consumers are affected. And so as we go through this presentation, some of this stuff is just filler as we explain why we're even caring about this, and then it goes into much more interesting stuff. If you have to leave, I understand, but you probably want to see the end of the talk. I think a lot of people think that they're very safe. They can just kind of surf the internet, and you're anonymous. I think especially consumers who aren't really accustomed to all the stuff that we work on, they have no idea how much is really vulnerable out there, and that you cannot guarantee privacy. So instead of attacking websites for once, we decided to go after consumers, the actual individuals behind the IP addresses that we come to know and love. So why is privacy good? There's a number of reasons why someone might want to be private. You guys know all about all the hacking stuff that's been going on the last couple days, yeah? Yeah, everybody? All right, good. So this is the kind of thing that it's really great for bad guys. They don't have any fear of repercussions because they can be anonymous. So it's good from their perspective. It's safer for political dissidents who maybe, I'm pro-Tibetan and someone's Chinese and they want to stop me from being pro-Tibetan. Safer for potential victims of violent crimes, so the elderly, women and children, anyone who might be susceptible to getting beaten up for whatever reason or stalked or whatever. It allows people to be themselves. So if you happen to like your cat a little bit too much, that's good for you. You can do that in the privacy of your home, and no one's going to think twice about it. It's safe for whistleblowers, so you can kind of anonymously tell people about stuff that's bad, that's happening, that might be affecting people's health or safety or whatever. And ultimately increases freedoms. Freedoms are, that's why we live in the United States. We like our freedoms, right? From that perspective, it's good. Trevor?
So why is privacy bad? The whole debate, you look at this particular issue from multiple different points of view, and privacy, if you're using it as a tool and trying to hide your identity from potentially, the police, law enforcement, and you're going to try to perform malicious actions, break the law, whatever your goal is, privacy can be used to help hide that identity. So it's really, whatever your intention is, you can utilize privacy to accomplish that goal. So in terms of hiding from law enforcement, it's very difficult for them to be able to say, okay, I know who this individual was, I can tie it back to a person, they performed this particular action, and it's difficult from their point of view. So what this does is it really translates back to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and how does that work online if dealing with privacy. So that's the whole issue here, where it's really a debate between the good and the bad, and it's really what are you trying to accomplish? And it's utilizing privacy in actually attacking those users.
So essentially, the ecosystem is a little too complex. There's too many moving parts, too many things residing in the browser or client-side technologies, too many ways for people to communicate, and all that stuff makes this whole ecosystem too complex. And what we're really trying to go after here is IP addresses. I mean, that when people are really saying, I want to de-anonymize you, what they're really saying is the gold standard is, I want to find out what your real IP address is. I don't really know what that is right now. You're coming through a proxy or whatever. I want to find out what it really is. But I think you can do better. I think that's interesting, and there's many ways to do that, and we'll talk about some new ways to do that. But there's a bunch of other stuff you can do as well. So Jobra's going to give you a quick starter on how to anonymize yourself, and then we'll break all that stuff.
Okay, so the basic anonymous guide, everybody here I hope uses tons of different Firefox plugins and whatnot, and you try to protect yourself and your identity. Well, the whole idea is that we're using a lot of different technologies. We're not designed for privacy. So it's a very difficult problem. So what do? We use things, proxies, hide my traffic in very interesting ways. Somebody might, if they hack a box, they can use that, bounce your traffic through another address, and the number of hops makes it more difficult for them to track the actual identity back to a specific person. So, the attackers have known this for years, and the security community is using things like Tor, so we can just chain a bunch of systems together and just route your traffic through this proxy, and that's all it really is. And what that translates to is a sense of privacy. It's not actually true privacy, but it gives you a sense of privacy. It's more difficult for me to identify who you are if you're using something along these lines. So the other component here is using free email systems. So if you wanted to, say sign up for whatever system you wanted, like you can use Lala or whatever. You can use free email systems to provide you a sense of privacy where they won't be tying it back to yourself at your company's website, whatever it is, your normal email address, and saying, okay, I know that this person is coming from this particular company. You lose a sense of privacy there. So with free email systems, you can gain a sense of privacy because you can say, well, I've created an email account for all these different technologies, and they're all tied back to one single account. So I'm not really losing anything there. So one of the issues that I was looking at was client-side certificates. And everybody uses client-side certificates. They're very popular. Everyone, you can have them in your browser. The normal use is so that they can ensure that the client is connecting to the server and maintaining this trust relationship. It's a trust relationship where the client is able to verify that the server is who they say they are. So that's great. However, these things can be used for good and bad. It looks at your point of view. So what if the user goes to a website and it has SSL, but it's not that website that you were trying to actually browse to, like your company VPN or something similar, right? And the browser will ask you, okay, so you've gone to this website. Would you like to send your public key? Well, yeah, okay, sure, click OK. Well, if you think about that for a moment, the public key that you're sending has nothing to do with this website. So why would you ever do that? Well, people just like to click OK when they see these pop-up windows. Maybe not everybody in this room, but your mom or whomever. So think about it. Logically, it does follow. So this is what it looks like. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is one certificate, and what I found was that if you look at the information that's actually stored within the certificates, there's a great deal of information there. So if we were to sniff this public key, we get a whole lot of data. And that data can be used to attack this user, de-anonymize them, and gain a sense as to what am I trying to get access to. So if I wanted to attack you or your company, I could say, okay, well, if I grab this key and I got this piece of information, I get the name of the system, maybe the operating system, if I get lucky, the username and email address. So you can get your email schema, which is the mechanism which email addresses are created by. So if it's first.last or something similar, you'll be able to identify that. The location of the server and some information about the certificate itself. What that provides is a sense as to, okay, I'm going to be able to attack this system within these specific dates, and I know that it's probably going to be a valid user. Okay, so what does this do? It says, okay, great. Now you know a username that's valid. Obviously, administrator and root are usually valid. However, you look at the last few, and it's first.last, first_last, and first-last. Well, now I know the name of the victim. And this is all based on the fact that their email addresses were generated in a specific manner. So that's really, really interesting because now we can tie that back to an individual. So now we're doing data correlation. This is not just an attack that's really just hypothetical. It's really tying this user on this particular system back to a server somewhere else. So you also have the validity of the date which the certificate expires on. So now you can say, okay, I know within this range of time, I'm going to have a valid user, so I can construct my brute force attack, and you're going to have a greater likelihood of actually succeeding. So there's really, you're increasing your chances of getting a shell because you're getting all of this information, you're putting it together, the logical steps, 1, 2, 3, and then logically the shell would follow. So we'll go to Tor.
So there's a whole bunch of ways to de-analyze people through Tor, and I'm actually not going to discuss a whole bunch of the specific things other than so that have already happened, other than a very small few. But one I wanted to point out was when the 100 embassy passwords were disclosed. I thought that was a really interesting example of where the attackers actually leaked too much information by the number of what they leaked. So it was exactly 100, not 105, not 97 or something. It was exactly 100. So that means they probably have a lot more than 100. And in truth, I have good evidence that they do. But passwords as strong as like 1, 2, 3, 4, and password and pyramid with an I, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so terrible, terrible passwords. Breach has a project where they have proxies that they've set up where you can actually basically they're trying to get people to go through them and trying to attack people through their proxies so they can detect what's going on. So it's sort of like honeypot proxies. I'm feeling quite a few companies have done stuff like that in the past as well. I think there's just probably one of the biggest. I think it's got like 7 to 10 nodes, and that was like a year ago, so it might have grown since then. I'm going to talk about the breaking proxies and Tor hack.
So one of the things that we were doing for preparation for this talk is actually looking at Tor and saying, if you were to sniff traffic, because that's all it is, it's just this proxy that just you route all your information through the Tor network, and then at the end, this particular end node is what they're called, is performing all these actions on behalf of you, your user. So in theory, you can just sniff all the traffic because you're susceptible and you're responsible for the traffic that's occurring from your address within some regard. It's very difficult to say, well, that was actually not me, that was somebody else, and I'm just a proxy. Well, that stuff is happening based on your address. So that's the idea. So sniffing traffic and determining where you're going, the end node, it's very possible that the end node is able to do that sort of thing.
So one very small technique, if they've got JavaScript installed, which is one of the privacy no-nos, don't ever turn on JavaScript if you want to be private. But a lot of people do it anyway. I just don't think they understand. But through the Onion network itself, you can actually route things over Onion network. So if you can visit this page, that means you've got to be on the Onion network. And in JavaScript space, I can detect, even though that is sort of a violation of cross-domain policy, but it's actually totally allowed. I'm actually able to detect that you were able to pull that image and therefore know that you are or aren't on a Tor node. Very one-liner, right? So ultimately, browsers break privacy because they lie about the concept of a same origin policy. Not like they're trying to be malicious about it, but there's a lot of reasons why if you have a really strict same origin policy, a lot of the stuff that we know and love about the web wouldn't work. But plugins lie worse because they don't necessarily at all follow what the browser does. They do whatever they were designed to do. They don't have to follow by the same rules. The browser doesn't really enforce that upon them. It's up to them to do the right thing. And in that context, the websites end up controlling the browser, not really the other way around when you're talking about a de-anonymization scenario where they have multiple plugins and JavaScript and that kind of stuff. So one thing I developed a couple years ago, maybe a year or two ago, can't remember, I released was Mr. T, the master recon tool. And basically you could go through and kind of iterate a bunch of the obvious JavaScript variables, things that were kind of low-hanging fruit to figure out what they've got installed, Firefox plugins. A lot of this stuff doesn't work as well as it used to just because things have changed. But other things they might have installed like DRM and that kind of stuff. Did you want to show them the video of this, the beef plugin with the CSS history thing? Yeah. Okay. Oh.
So one of the components that I was looking at was, I don't know, are you guys familiar with the browser exploitation framework? Show of hands, yes, no? Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, what it is, it's a browser exploitation framework. So it allows for an attacker to be able to perform all these different types of actions if they're able to get a user to connect to a page. And the traditional example is you use cross-site scripting. Somebody wrote the book on that. Anyways.
Don't bother buying it.
So you get cross-site scripting, you inject your malicious JavaScript, you get this client to connect to the beef framework, and they're called a zombie. And what you can do with this browser exploitation framework is do a lot of the types of techniques that we're demonstrating. I've ported a lot of the code to beef to make it easier to demonstrate all of these different types of techniques because we want them to not just be theoretical, we want them to be practical, usable, and we want penetration testers to use them in their daily pen test. So we want to make this stuff usable. So one of the components that I looked at was VMware detection. And previously, Wade Alcorn, who's the author of Beef, released a mechanism for doing VMware detection within Beef. So what he used was an ActiveX control to be able to determine the MAC address of the system. So then he did a couple of regular expression-based checks to determine, okay, we are actually running the system on VMware. So what I've done is I looked at that and I said, well, that's really interesting. However, it's limited because of the fact that it only runs in IE. A lot of people use Linux. A lot of people use Firefox. We'd like it to be more flexible, and we want it to be real world. So a few other of the components that we've included that were already there in Beef is plugin detection, what are the plugins that you're running, and what does it look like? I also added a setup script to the Backtrack 4 live CD to make it easier for people to actually set up and run. So all you need to do is do setup-beef.sh, and you're good. However, the cloud is the new hotness, so let's get to improving this virtualization detection. So the new versions of this virtualization detection that I wrote was being able to detect not only VMware, but also QEMU, which is an open source virtualization mechanism, and VirtualBox, which is a virtualization based from some microsystems. And then the final component that I added was Amazon EC2 detection. And we can even detect what region they're in. And this is all based on the same technique. We're just using a little bit different technology to do that. So the technology that I'm using is a Java applet to determine the MAC address, do a few just regular expression checks, and then we're able to determine if we're in VMware, QEMU, VirtualBox. So it works pretty much everywhere, and it's seamless to the user. It just depends on what you're trying to, where you're running it. I did have a few issues with Mac OS X, and that's due to a 64-bit issue in the browser. But anywhere that Java runs, it'll run. So I've added this as a new module to the next version of Beef, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So what we're doing here is we're able to gain a lot of information about the users in our attack against, this organization or this particular user in itself. So once we gain this information, we're able to make the attack much more beneficial. So that doesn't really get us a shell. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, well, we know this stuff about the user, but could we actually turn that stuff into a shell? And as it turns out, we can. One of the mechanisms that I utilized was a Java applet, and when it was executed, all it did was it dropped an executable and ran it on the client. So I can detect that you're in Java, or you have Java enabled within your browser, and this particular plugin that I wrote for Beef will simply deploy and execute my applet. It just runs it. You click OK, single click, you get a shell. That's pretty good. The other mechanism that I added to Beef was a redirection in an iframe. So all those guys at Metasploit are doing this browser autopwn. Well, we can get root shells based on the types of vulnerabilities within the browser. So if your browser's old, you're not patched, we get a shell. We have some demos, and I'll probably save them for the end. Do you think that's? Yeah, that'd be fine. So here's all the stuff. I mean, we've really made it easy for anyone to be able to utilize. We have the Tor detection, which is based on browsing to a Tor-only address, which is the .onion address. So that's how the Tor detection works. Arsync did some work with an AJAX ping sweeping tool, and what it does is it's able to determine if there are internal IP addresses accessible from this device. So what we can do there is utilizing this within the browser exploitation framework. We can say, now I can start mapping out the internal network. So when I get there, I know what I'm going to be expecting. The Java applet, which gives us a remote shell, and the browser autopwn, which integrates with Metasploit very nicely. And now you can just have more flexibility in your attack. Another one of the components that I updated for the browser exploitation framework is determining what addresses the user has actually visited. So previously, I believe there were 4 or 5 addresses included. So I simply took a list of Alexa and the top 500, and I've included those. So now we can determine where the user has been in the past and all this information about the user. So I talked with Wade, and he told me that there will be a new version of Beef coming. So here's the address if you're not already familiar with it. So let's do some demos. Actually, we'll do those at the end. I think that's best.
So there's a whole bunch of ways that I'm just going to briefly go through them. There's ways to grab internal address space, Java, Flash. This stuff's been out there forever. SCP. SCP was one of my favorite because you could actually force people to upload their content to a remote site. It's beautiful. Since been patched. Word PDF bugs. You can actually go to decloak.net, and that stuff's already sitting there, so you can try it out yourself. Interestingly, I went through and was trying to figure out, is there an easy way to shortcut and just kind of look at all the stuff that might be vulnerable? So I went to About Config and looked for the protocol handlers, and I was scanning through them, and really, it doesn't cover a good chunk of the things that I was actually using to do a decloaking. So I don't think there is a really good way to short circuit this research. You really just have to go through every single plugin and try it and try to configure your proxy and go back and forth and see if you're de-anonymizing yourself. It's kind of a pain. ITMS was something that I found a while back, actually. I didn't publish it, but it's actually on Decloak. It's there already. So I talked to HD Moore, and they were having problems routing through apple.com using the ITMS protocol. And so they found a redirect, and it allowed them to go through the redirect, but then they closed the redirect down, so that wasn't going to work anymore. Then I found a bug in the way that they handled the actual sort of regex internally that allowed you to redirect to any domain you wanted. And suddenly, if you're using Firefox with one proxy setting and IE's in another proxy setting, it'll use the IE proxy. So you go to a site, they give you this iframe, it automatically redirects you through the other proxy setting of the IE browser, of the IE rendering engine, and poof. So interestingly, I had a conversation with Apple about this a while back, I guess a couple weeks ago or a week ago or something, and they said that they don't know. Is it really their bug? I mean, clearly there's a problem with this IT mess thing, but they have other stuff that might be vulnerable as well. But the real question is this really their problem or not? And they don't know. They think it may be Firefox's, it might be theirs, it might be IE's, who knows? So I think that's kind of a TBD and probably a bigger conversation. So there's a thing that I didn't invent this. I think David Byrne built this originally. Res timing still works in IE. It's a little slow, but it allows you to enumerate any file you want on the file system. So if you ask, is this file there, you can figure it out pretty quickly within a few seconds. So that's fantastic. It's great because it allows you to do any single file, but it's also so slow that it's really bad for scanning an entire drive to figure out what's on it. So, and also it's in JavaScript space. So I invented a version that's not in JavaScript space, that's only CSS, and that seems to work great, but it's also very slow, and I don't think it's particularly practical in of itself, the way we were doing it. So we came up with another way to do it, called SMB enum. And funny, I told Rich Mogul that I could enumerate his drive, and then I sent him a link, and his comment was, "What the fuck?" And that really shouldn't be allowed. And he's right. It seems weird. So SMB enum, I'll show it in a second, but basically allows me to pull a single file from the computer, as long as it's like an image or a piece of CSS or something that the browser can actually render and know what to do cross-domain. This only works in IE, and it sort of seemed like it had limited use at first because it was only pulling images. So we kind of put it back-burnered for a while, and I didn't even publish it. So I'll come back to that in a second. So usernames and computer names are really what we're after, though. We really want to know what their actual name is. That would be even better. So if you cut and paste that URL in IE, you will be sending me your computer name and the full path. Computer name and the full path of your user. I kind of try to obfuscate it by uppercasing and lowercasing it. It only works if you cut and paste it. I tried every single combination I could think of putting it inside, Word documents and iframes and CSS and everything I could think of to try to make it pop. And the only thing that worked was cutting and pasting. But it's still not that bad. You send someone a link and you're like, hey, and you make it like slightly broken, so they have to kind of fix it themselves, meaning they're cutting and pasting it. As soon as they cut and paste it, it gives up all that information, which is pretty nice. And then SMB proper, just using SMB, this simple one-liner will basically transmit, it's just iframe source file : / will send this. This is kind of a well-known one, but I started looking at it a little bit more. I actually did a dump of the packets, and it's actually sending both the computer name and, so this is the computer name for my test machine, and my name, Robert Hansen, and Windows 2000, all the stuff. So it actually delivers a lot of stuff. So with a single iframe, you can basically deliver all this content about who the person is that's contacting you. Great for de-anonymization. So SMB enum comes into play at this point, where I can actually enumerate all of these images that are on your computer. So that's only useful for if you're talking about programs. It's not really useful if you're trying to enumerate a user. But if you have some of that other stuff and you can sort of say, well, all right, I know that their username is blah, then I can sort of tack it on with SMB enum and find files that are located in there, and then say, okay, I want to go more granular, and then you can use res timing, so you kind of stack these exploits on top of one another, and suddenly you can say, all right, I know that the username is this, full path is this, there's where a file is, here's where a directory is, here's the exact, a specific file inside that directory. So it actually works out pretty nicely if you start stacking the exploits together. You could technically use SMB enum to do brute force. I actually built it, and then I just deleted it because I got too sick of actually working on it. It's one of those moments of frustration. I'm like, screw you. It did work. It was just so slow that I got tired of waiting around for it to try to figure out that my name was Robert Hansen. I mean, it worked, but I had to wait for a good day or so for it to enumerate. On to the good stuff, and then we'll talk about demos afterwards. So one of the things I was originally thinking about as we were going through this exercise of kind of thinking about what is and isn't good for de-anonymization, all that stuff is great, but ultimately it means that you have to basically come to my site, and I have to know ahead of time that you're coming to my site, and then I have to decide I want to de-anonymize you now. Otherwise, I'm de-anonymizing everybody, and that sets off alarm bells. So how do you do it silently without actually setting off those alarm bells and getting some really significant data out of them? So we went back and forth, and then I started thinking about malware. Well, malware is great, but if you try to drop malware on every box, that's another issue. So what if you could like piggyback on stuff like the Alexa toolbar, which is basically spyware anyway? And it's like, no, that's not particularly good because not many people have it. You got to think about like what does everybody have. So I started looking at safe browsing. Safe browsing is built into Google. Instead of Google, it is Google. It's built inside of Firefox and Chrome. And basically all it does is say, if you go to a phishing site that it knows about, it has a list that it's downloaded to your computer, it checks against that list and says, okay, you are or aren't on that list, so you are blocked or not blocked. And so that's fantastic. It's great for security from that perspective, but it turns out that it's always phoning home. And not just phoning home like, and that's benignly phoning home, grabbing a new list. It's actually sending a lot more information. So I apologize, and a lot of you are sitting way back there, so there's no chance you're going to be able to see this, but you have to trust me. So I make a request. So this is like if I've never used it before. So I make a request, and it goes out, and then it pulls back a couple of things. First of all, a big old cookie, pref cookie. You can see it third line down, or you can't because you're too far back. You can move forward if you want, I don't care. And then a bunch of other stuff that's sort of like a pre-shared key that it will continue to use beyond that for that entire session. So you're kind of merrily surfing along, making requests, and it's kind of in the background sending these requests back and forth, with a bunch of different information, with their secret key that's being posted back and forth, the pref cookies getting set back and forth. And this is all being done on google.com. So if you're surfing along and you hit Google, because you're going to AdWords, or actually AdWords is a bad example, but you just happen to surf along the site and you happen to hit something that's Google related, that goes to Google domain, it'll send that cookie back. So let's say that you want to anonymize yourself, so you're using Tor or some proxy or something, and so you've been surfing around all day. You've got a cookie, so Google's now tracking you based on that IP address. You turn on the Tor node and you start connecting through your proxy just like you normally would, and you start hacking somebody. Well, all of a sudden, you're phoning home, but now you're phoning home through the proxy. So it still knows that you're the same person because that pref cookie is the same. So basically, Google can track you as you hop from proxy to proxy. So let's say I'm that company who just got hacked into, and I'm like, I really want to bust that guy. Well, I know that they're using Firefox. There's a good chance that they haven't turned this off because, really not many people go in and start messing around with their about config or going a couple options deep. So they probably haven't turned this off because they probably don't think it's bad. So hey Google, or hey FBI, will you help me out and issue subpoena or warrant or whatever? They go say, hey Google, just go, tell me who this IP address is related to and so on. And suddenly they can track you back to all the previous IP addresses that are associated with that. So unless you clean out that cookie, you're basically completely compromised, and you need to clean it out both when you are about to start your session and when you're about to deconstruct that session and go back to your normal user account. Because if you don't do it exactly at the right time, then you're correlating that information together. So now you're saying, well, okay, I've hacked in the past. Wow, I should probably go, turn that off right now. Well, it doesn't matter, right? They've already logged the information. So as long as Google hasn't deleted it, and I don't know what their policy is on deleting all of that information, they still have it. So the good news is that they say that they only retain most of the data, or all of the data for, I think it was like 10 days or something. I forget what 2 weeks or something. And then they say they keep it in aggregate. So there's two ways to do things in aggregate. One is you have like high-level statistics, like we had this many people using it over this time period. That would be aggregate. But another way to say aggregate is this IP address, this cookie, this timestamp, which is a very small amount of information, but that's easily enough information to decloak somebody 2 years ago on some hack incident that you just happened to be using Firefox at that time. So if you use Firefox or Chrome and you have this turned on, you're taking a privacy versus security trade-off by turning this on and off, but you should probably at least know the risks. So it sets up and tears down pretty quickly, which is nice. I think it phones home about, on average, about 1 every 2 minutes. It's really about 30 times an hour is how it works out. And I think it's actually more like 30 times, what is it? Yeah, is it 15 times every 30 minutes or something. It goes kind of a fast burst, then stops, fast burst, then stops. So I haven't gone through and actually looked at what's going on under the hood too much, just because I didn't have a whole lot of time to do it. But I actually did spend some time looking at Chrome. So, and then we'll actually go into demos, but, so this is a typical Chrome phoning home and saying, hey, I need to see if I've got any updates for Chrome. So it sends a packet, a payload, that has a bunch of information in it, including two pretty interesting things, machine ID and user ID. So I don't know why Google needs to know what my ID is to give me an update to my browser, but apparently that's important to them. I mean, this phone's home about once every 5 hours or so. So if you're like on a long all-nighter hacking spree or whatever, there's a good chance that it's been phoning home that whole time, and there's a good chance that you've been decloaked during that process if they choose to use that information. So we have the privacy policy. Can I just alt-tab away from this? Yeah. Want to read it?
Okay. So the interesting component of the privacy policy is here. That's right here. So we have a good faith belief that access, use, preservation, or disclosure of the information is reasonable, necessary to satisfy any applicable law, regulation, legal process or enforcement. So this whole thing, if you really look at this, it's up for interpretation. It's debate. I don't even know what it says. I'm not a lawyer. I mean, you look at this. This is marketing speak. It's totally...
Well, one thing in particular it does say was in section
D.
I think it's D, protect against harm to the rights, property, or safety of Google. So it's basically completely up to them what they do with this information. But so essentially, if the FBI gets a warrant or subpoena for this information, I think they have 60 days to force them to retain that data. I'm not 100% sure about that number, but they have some fairly large amount of time that they can force Google to retain that information. So even if Google does remove that information and really does that large-scale aggregate stuff, it just doesn't matter. They can go and say, delay it, continue to keep that information for, up to 60 days beyond that, and then we'll go and collect that information. So ultimately, this is a great way to decloak somebody long-term, and you can go backwards in time. Many months or many years, depending on how this information is held. Unfortunately, I have no way of knowing how that information is held without breaking into their systems or them giving me access. So it's totally speculation, but I don't know. I just feel like you probably should know about it.
So again, it's default Firefox configuration. So everyone who's used Firefox, who wasn't aware about these issues, it's there. Safe browsing, unless you explicitly disable it, it already has occurred. So there is already, we all know that Google is, in essence, like Big Brother. It's like 1984, like, come on. However, here is the reason and the actual way that they can get the access to this data. These techniques demonstrate that they have the information, and all it would really take would be the government coming in and saying, we want access to it. So the first demo was, so how do you disable that? That was the best demo. So let's do this. So everybody who's used Firefox before pretty much knows about config and just simply going in and saying, let's just do some reconfiguration on the browser. So it's called safe browsing. You can also do it from tools, but just for demonstration purposes, we're just using about config. So all we need to do is just go through, double click, and we just disable safe browsing. There's no need to have it running. Privacy against security, and that's your trade-off. You want to be protected. The real reason for safe browsing is actually protect the user against these malware-infected websites. Well, if I know that I'm not browsing to any malware-infected websites, what do you want to do? I mean, that's really your call, and what we're trying to do is make sure that you guys are aware of these issues. So, So this is a few demonstrations using the browser exploitation framework. And this one in particular was the SMB enum. What it does is it enumerates the software on the system using the Java mechanism that Arsenic had previously discussed. So here what we're doing is, let me just back up a little bit. So this is the browser exploitation framework for those who haven't used it. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a client connected to the framework. And then all the attacker needs to do is simply go to the menu and select what action they'd like to perform against this user. So let me just go back a little bit. So all he did was he went through the menu, selected SMB enum, and we continue. Select the client, and then just click send. From there, we get all the data and the result of the actual payload.
Incidentally, this is not all of the things you can enumerate. That was just a list that I kind of hacked together in, I don't know, probably 20 minutes or something. So if you have things that you specifically want to check for, you just need to either use res colon or SMB enum, one of the two, to iterate it. If it has an image associated or something you can pull in JavaScript space or CSS space or an image or whatever, this is great because it's fast. If not, then use res colon.
So this demonstration is detecting the virtualization mechanism that's being used by the client. And in this example, I was using VMware. It works in QEMU, it will work in VirtualBox, it will work in Amazon EC2. I just didn't have those systems at the time when I was working on the demonstrations. So just zoom in here. So again, we select the client, click send, it sends the information, and now we have the result. The browser is within VMware. And it's literally just a regular expression check, so all we need to do to make this useful for other different types of mechanisms, if the MAC address is correlated back to the specific type of virtualization, that's all I need. I just need the first 3 octets, and I can write some additional checks. Regular expression checks are no problem for me. So, in this demonstration, we're looking at detecting the plugins within the browser. It's similar to Mr. T and a lot of different techniques, but it's nice to just say, okay, we have all of this in the browser exploitation framework because that's where you would want to do a lot of these different types of techniques, and then translating those into root shells. So here we have a client who has tons of plugins enabled. And each one of these plugins can be vulnerable. Don't misunderstand. That's the idea here. We're looking at, I can identify this user is running these types of plugins, therefore I'll target my attack at that user, which is what we do in the Java example. So in the malicious Java applet, it was detect if they're running Java, and then present them with a Java applet which was self-signed by the Microsoft Corporation. I self-signed it myself, no problem, and the user clicks OK, and when they click OK, that OK is just downloading and running this executable. This executable was created by the Metasploit MSF payload to simply just drop me a shell. So all we need to do is specify the URL, click send, and wait for the applet to run. It works in IE, it works in Firefox. So they click run, and there's your shell. That for me is pretty damn cool. I don't know about you guys, but there's no patch for this. You can't fix this problem. That's by design, right? So the next example.
Safe browsing is the patch.
Yeah, safe browsing is the patch. The next example is just, okay, we have a user who's in the browser exploitation framework. Maybe I don't want to, or they don't have Java enabled. Okay, well we can rely on Metasploit because Metasploit's great. It has this thing called autopwn, which just enumerates a bunch of ODAs against your browser, whatever browser you're running. In this example, I didn't set up the actual autopwn. I just had netcat listening on a shell, It was like port 9000. So here you see the client connects and it just transmits the information. Just adding an iframe to the system and redirecting that iframe to my listener on the attacker system. So if you were using Metasploit, what you would do would be, all right, I'll just have an ODay listening, any browser that connects, drop me a shell. That's good enough. Or I can use browser autopwn, either way. We had one more, the visited. So in this example, we're just iterating through all the different URLs and determining where the actual client has gone in the past.
Using CSS history.
Yeah, that's right. The technique uses the past CSS history, and what you're doing is you're looking at the colors within the actual browser to determine if you've browsed to these locations. So obviously we can increase the module by just adding additional links. What I'll do is I'll make it a little bit easier for people to add their own links, and then do a little bit more customization on actually the interface, because the interface was really proof of concept to get it to work for this demo, and I'm going to improve that a little bit.
So I apologize that you guys are kind of alone in here. Normally this would probably be a little bit more filled just because no one knew we were even speaking. But thank you for hanging out with us. Sorry for, if you were here to see Monsanto guys, I apologize. They couldn't be here, sorry. But was there any questions? Do you guys have any questions about anything we did? That cannot be true. Guarantee at least one person comes up and asks me a question afterward. Yeah.
So, I just learned how to spell beef yesterday. Where do I start?
Bindshell.net.
Yeah. If you download, actually, probably an easier way than that even is go download the Backtrack CD. It's Jabra is the guy. He's the master. So
Backtrack 4 setup-beef.sh. That's all you need.
yeah, it's stupid simple. As long as you have something sitting there, as long as it can connect to the internet, as long as it's on the internet or your firewall allows that connection to come in, it's very, very simple. It's just a web server, and that web server is interactive. The piece of JavaScript is tiny. You can rewrite it if you want to, but it's pretty tiny. You just include it on some random web page. You XSS somebody somewhere. I mean, how many pages are vulnerable to cross-site scripting, right? So getting them into the shell is relatively easy. It's just a matter of what you do with them at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a few other things to actually show. Think about it. So this is the technique that we talked about. This is how we actually did the intercepting of the client-side certificate. Just quickly, just set up OpenSSL. It's one line. Create me a public key, get it running, and then sniff the traffic. Well, the traffic has all the data, the common name, when it expires, all that information that was juicy, and it's just relating back. I mean, that data is, it was out there.
So speaking of cross-site scripting, does anyone know who Sammy is? Sammy Worm? He's here in Vegas. He cross-site scripted my phone and said, hey, JavaScript kitty, you in Vegas, kisses Sammy. So Sammy has arrived. Any questions? Any other stuff? We'll just, yeah. Actually, I don't know. I'm sure it probably is fairly. Actually, I think it is. In fact, I think I actually saw the option. I just didn't actually go through the process of clicking on it. But yeah, it's one of their configuration tools. Actually, pretty minimal. I don't know if you've seen it. It's only like one full page long kind of thing. There aren't very many options in Chrome. It's stripped down in many ways. So yeah, it was pretty easy to turn off from what I saw, but I didn't actually go through that process. But that doesn't help you if it's still doing that auto update every 5 hours. And I don't know how to turn off the fact that it's doing that. Yes?
I don't know, I would recommend, well, so it seems that we have a problem with sending that cookie. I know when we originally designed the feature, we wanted not to send the same cookie as the one we're adjusting. Apparently, the bug is there somewhere, or someone, I don't know. But turning off malware detection is not as safe as like don't go to sites that could be evil. Because when we first enabled that feature, very quickly we ran into like one of the web developer sites and we hacked the persistent XSS that and someone had injected code that used tried to exploit like old versions of Firefox. And so this was one of the like developer sites.
Right. So I think the answer to that is, if I'm sorry for those of you who didn't hear, he was basically saying that I assume you work for Google. Is that? Oh, you work for Firefox. So he said that the fact that it's sending the cookie was not by design, but there it is, and that turning off the malware detection is not as just as simple as don't visit a safe site, because there's a way to cross-site scripting somebody from a site that you trust. And the answer to that is, if you're really interested in anonymization, you probably don't have JavaScript turned on in the first place. So it's kind of it's an argument, but I think it's a lesser argument than that it's just sending it all the time. But I agree. If there was a way to be safe yet not be leaking all your privacy out, that would be excellent. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. In fact, I even talked to the Tor button guys. Smart guys, they really understand what's going on, and yes, it does delete the cookie when you turn it on and off. That's not necessarily true with update mechanisms. I just haven't gone through all that other research. But from what I talked to them, I think they really understand the problem, probably better than almost anybody. They're very on the ball. Yeah. So if you're going to use Tor button. Well, thanks, guys.